What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then what's up? My name's Erica. Heya, how you doing? For today's video, I'm going to be giving you kind of a context episode, kind of a fun mythology episode, kind of a low-key chit-chat episode. It's a lot of things, whilst also being like one thing, I guess, as well, because it's just like one video. But anyways, however you want to categorize this video, we're going to be giving you that video today about the curse on the House of Atreus. In saying all of that, we should probably roll into the video, but before we do, please do not forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. And now that you've done that, let's get into the video. The curse on the House of Atreus. This curse is probably the most famous curse in all of Greek mythology. It is generational, so it starts way further back than probably a lot of you guys are familiar with, and probably a lot further back than you guys even know this family goes in Greek mythology. So it is absolutely vital that we understand that in order to then read characters like Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, Menelaus even, all of those characters correctly, because this plays a huge, huge role in their contemporary lives at the time of mythology. I don't know how else to say that, but in their everyday lives, as they go through mythology, this curse, this past, this harboring of generations that have lived before them is plaguing them. Now, just one last note, and I swear to God we will start, but one last note that I just want to make clear, because I want to avoid comments being like, Erica, this isn't the version that I've read. What I've done in order to construct the whole story, because we are starting with generations past and we're going to end with Orestes, not even Agamemnon, we're going to end with his son. That's how far the story is going to go. What I've done is really just compiled the most famous versions of the story. I will at times be referencing, oh, there's this other really famous version, but we're going to go with this one, blah, 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 throughout as I talk. However, again, there are so many different versions of the story, and that is so important for you guys to understand. This has been adapted 100,000 times in ancient Greece. Obviously, that's not an exact number. That's just me over-exaggerating it. But every single author seems to have a different version of this story. So just bear that in mind. And in any of my other videos on the channel, if you guys need them for school, so I do all of these breakdowns of the Oresteia, the Iliad, the Odyssey, all of that. If the curse has been mentioned differently in any of those, or specifically on the page in any of those books, I will always specify the version that that author is going with, because obviously that's important for that story. So this is very, very general, and it's really a beginner's guide to the curse on the House of Atreus with the most famous versions. Now let's just, let's just start with the curse. Let's start all the way back where this whole thing began. The curse on the family of the House of Atreus actually begins generations before Atreus is even a thought, okay? So Atreus was a man in Greek mythology, however, he comes much, much later in this story, and we're gonna start with Tantalus. So who is Tantalus? According to most mythology, Tantalus' father is Zeus, the king of the gods, right? We know that he has a whole history, he has a whole personality trait at this point of hooking up with randoms and having 1,000,005 children. Tantalus happens to be one of them. However, Tantalus' mother is written as either being a random nymph called Pluto, not to be confused, by the way, with the Roman version of Hades, who is called Pluto. This is a totally different nymph. Or it could be Dione. Tantalus then has two incredibly famous children. One of them, if you guys are familiar with Greek mythology, is Niobe. Niobe is a woman, I won't explain that whole myth, but she basically said that she was more fertile because she had more children than the Titan goddess Leto, which meant that Leto's two children, who are Apollo and Artemis, got super mad and killed all of Niobe's children. That is a legitimate myth. It is horrible, but that's who Niobe is. And Tantalus' other famous child is Pelops, who we will need later on in the story, so I will not explain who he is right now. But going into the most famous part of the story, and where we really get into how this curse in the House of Atreus really began, is because Tantalus, one way or another, one day he gets invited to dine with the Olympian gods. In various mythologies, the reasons are totally different, but the most important thing is that Tantalus ends up having dinner with the Olympians. Now, we then have three versions of what happens when Tantalus gets to dinner, and all of them result in the exact same punishment. So this is one of the times where I'm going to tell you all the different versions of what exactly Tantalus does in order to anger the gods, and specifically, he really angers Zeus at dinner. So the first thing that he does is option A, right? He hears the gods talking about their plans for humanity, and when he goes home, he tells all of his friends, which obviously the gods are like, well, that's not cool. The second thing that he does is possibly steal nectar and ambrosia from the dinner table, which is the food of the gods, and again, when he gets home, he ends up handing that out to all of his mortal friends, which again, the gods are not happy about. And the third option is the most famous option, and it's the one that we are going to use for this myth. This is the one that I'm telling you is my favorite version of the story, and it is the most famous version of the story, and that is that when Tantalus gets to dinner with the Olympians, he wants to cook. And so he decides that when he's cooking, he is going to test the gods on if they are really all-knowing, if they are really these really smart gods that should be at the status that they are. So what does Tantalus do? Tantalus decides that he is going to chop up his own son, season him, and pop him in a stew. And if the gods can tell that the meat in the stew is actually his child, Pelops, well then the gods are who they say they are. So this is a totally wild thing that Tantalus decides to do on any scale. This is not normal for mythology, okay? Normal for this family, as we'll see, but not for general mythology. So when Tantalus serves up his dinner to the gods, we are told that immediately the gods know that something is wrong. They don't take any sip or anything of the stew. They don't eat any of the stew, aside from Demeter. So Demeter, what's important is when this version of the myth is told, we know that Demeter has just lost Persephone. So Persephone has just gone missing. She has not yet found Persephone. So when she's sitting at the table and the stew gets served around, the Pelops stew gets served to all of the gods, she is not noticing, she's not smelling anything, she's not, like, literally she's not in the room, right? She's just overcome with grief, and so she does take a bite of her stew, and when she does, the other gods are like, stop! Something's up with the stew! So the gods, obviously, get super mad at Tantalus when they figure out what's going on with the stew. They're just like, absolutely not, you can't be killing your children, and we can't allow this to happen without punishment. So, first things first is that Zeus actually forms Pelops back together. They decide that he deserves a second chance at life, so they take all of his bits out of the stew and they try to make him a human, but because Demeter had eaten a chunk of his shoulder, in some versions of the story he gets a prosthetic shoulder, like they just kind of help him out because his shoulder can't be fully formed because Demeter's consumed it. Awkward! So Pelops gets a second chance at life, but Tantalus gets punished and gets sent to the underworld. Now this is super famous because when Tantalus is sent to the underworld, he gets one of the most famous punishments, and that is to stand in a body of water just beneath a tree that has lots of fruit hanging off of it. Except whenever Tantalus goes to drink from, the water around him, the water recedes. And whenever he reaches up to try and take some of the fruit to have a bite to eat, the tree pulls away just out of arm's reach. And so this is where we get the word tantalizing from in modern day English. And I'm sure in other languages they have their various versions of this, but this is where we get the word tantalizing from. That is the myth of where we get that from. So that's Tantalus's punishment, right? But as this happens, Zeus curses all of his family, right? So Zeus is like, you're a fucked up guy. The rest of your family is because of that, and they shouldn't get off scot-free when you tried to serve your son on a silver platter to the Olympian deities. So this is the first time that the family get cursed, but it is certainly not the last time. What people don't realize is that there is just like a buildup of curses in this family. Finally, then when we get down to Orestes, it's like, you have so much shit to handle and to weed through. But anyways, we'll get there in time. But let's cut back to Pelops. Let's see what he's doing. Okay, so some versions of this myth, and I did want to mention this because it will come up later, some versions of this myth state that when he was put back together, the god Poseidon saw him. Poseidon fell madly in love with him, watched him from afar, just thought he was this gorgeous person. Some versions have them, go off together. This is, very, very niche mythology basically, but I just wanted it to be noted that sometimes Poseidon sees him and takes a favoring to Pelops, because that will come up later. Because the time in Pelops' life that we're really gonna hop into is when Pelops decides that he wants to get married. So he hears of this princess who is available to be married, and her dad has come up with these games in order for suitors to compete for her hand in marriage, which is a very normal thing in the ancient world. But what isn't normal is that this king is slightly insane, and by slightly insane, I mean completely psychotic, and he has basically made Squid Game for the ancient world. Because what he decides to do is that everybody who wants to marry his daughter, who's called Hippodamia, anybody who wants to marry her, has to come and compete in a chariot race, right? Which sounds really harmless, but if you lose the chariot race is only against him, so it's one-on-one. And if you lose to Hippodamia's father, the king of this place, he kills you, right? And if you think like, oh, Pelops was going to go and he was going to be the first person to do this was just a threat and nobody ended up dying. No, this king actually killed like 13 of the previous suitors for Hippodamia. So he is serious, okay? He means business. So Pelops ends up going to try and marry Hippodamia, and this is where Poseidon might get involved if we go with that version of the story, because if Poseidon takes a liking to him, Poseidon knows that this king is kind of crazy and so gifts Pelops a chariot, right? Because Poseidon is the god of horses, so he gifts him this chariot with these, godly horses, so he wants him to win, he doesn't want him to die, basically. But in other versions, if we don't have the Poseidon one, he's just a really good charioteer. And when he gets to the kingdom in order to win Hippodamia, Hippodamia supposedly falls madly in love with him the first time that she sees him. She's just like, oh my God, this is the hottest man I have ever seen. And the idea that my father might kill him is unacceptable. Unacceptable. He must live. So what does she do? In a panic, she goes to one of her father's servants, who's this guy called Metellus. Myrtillus. Metellus, I think is how you say it. But anyway, so she goes to him and she says, I need you to help me. I need you to make sure that my father's chariot is a bit loose. It's a little bit basically. You can go and do that without it seeming weird if you get close to the chariot. Can you just screw with the chariot a little bit so that this guy has a chance to win? Now, what they barter, what she decides to offer him is changed in mythology. So sometimes she says to him that if you help me, we'll take you with us so that if my father finds out, he won't kill you because we'll then have you as a servant in our home. Or, according to the very dark mythology and according to Metellus' side of the story, Hippodamia promises him that she will hook up with him. In most mythologies, that is not the case, and I want to make that very clear, but I did want to mention it. Either way, Metellus agrees. Metellus goes and he screws with the chariot, and obviously then Pelops wins. So Pelops whisks Hippodamia away, and as they are leaving to go towards the Peloponnese, which by the way is named after Pelops, fun fact, they stop for water along the way, and as Pelops leaves the chariot to go and pick up some water for his now new bride, Metellus apparently makes a move on her, and obviously Pelops gets super mad, and so he slaughters him. He's just like, absolutely not. And so when he's slaughtering him in Metellus' last dying breath, he also curses the house that Pelops and the family that Pelops will end up having. So now we've got two curses on this house of Atreus. But the story's not done yet. So fast forward a number of years, Pelops, Hippodamia, they have multiple children together. Their two most famous sons, and actually the couple's only two sons because the rest are girls, are Atreus and Thyestes. So now these are two names, hence Curse in the House of Atreus. These are two names that everybody is probably familiar with. But I wanted to mention the backstory because people don't realize there are already possibly two curses already on this family when we get here. Anywho, fast forward after the kids are, grown. They're not fully grown, but they're grown. And they are sort of running around doing their things, learning the ways of the palace. Pelops gets bored with his family life, as lots of men do in Greek mythology. And so he fucks off and he goes to hook up with a nymph. And the nymph births him a child called Chrysippus. Now, over the years, as Hippodamia watches Chrysippus grow up from afar, she can kind of see that actually her husband Pelops is favoring Chrysippus. And this is not a good position for her to be in because she has two sons who should be the heirs to everything that Pelops has. And she worries that actually Chrysippus, now that he's the favorite, is going to take the fortune, the lifestyle, everything pretty much from her children, which is a massive, massive problem. Again, the mythology goes into two different ways here. Regardless of how it happens, though, Chrysippus ends up dying. In some versions, we have the sons Atreus and Thyestes who are told by their mother to go and kill him. In some versions, Hippodamia does it herself. But regardless, Chrysippus ends up dying, and obviously, Pelops is so pissed off. In every single version, he exiles all three of them. So he exiles both of his sons, Thyestes and Atreus, and also exiles his wife. But in the majority of versions, unfortunately, Hippodamia does not want to go into exile, and so she hangs herself instead in order to avoid that whole fiasco. But Atreus and Thyestes they willingly go into exile and they just start wandering around. They go from the Peloponnese all the way up through to the Argolid, where they end up at Mycenae, famously. Okay, backstory that you need to know for the Mycenaeans is that they have been patiently waiting for a king, and they've been told by an oracle quite a while ago that it's going to be a son of what's his name? Pelops. How the hell did I forget that? Anyways, so they knew it was going to be one of his sons, and now 2 of them show up. So they're like, great. So after a few years, the sons don't, they have to kind of pick one or the other, and they end up deciding that whoever has this fleece, this like regal fleece, again, this is mythology, you need to bear this in mind. They decide whoever has this fleece is going to be king. Now, when Atreus suggests this, Thyestes agrees. And Atreus thinks it's really weird because Atreus knows he is in possession of this fleece. So when Thyestes is like, yeah, sure, whoever has this fleece is fine, Atreus goes to retrieve it, can't find it anywhere, and goes back to Thyestes, and it turns out that he has the fleece. So Thyestes is immediately crowned as king of Mycenae. Now this is really funky because Atreus is like, how the hell did that happen? And he just assumes that Thyestes stole it from him when he wasn't looking. But what we know as the audience is that actually Thyestes had ended up seducing Atreus's new wife, and his new wife ends up stealing the fleece from Atreus and bringing it to Thyestes, and that is how Thyestes was in possession of it. But Atreus does not know this yet. He will know it, but he doesn't know it right now. However, in a lot of versions of this story, Zeus is not happy with Thyestes being on the throne, and Zeus really wants Atreus to be on the throne because he knows that that is the person that needs to be on the throne. And so he sends Hermes in this version down to tell Atreus to tell Thyestes that actually the person who should be king, it should be Atreus, and if he's going to be king, it will be the day that the sun goes in the opposite direction to what it normally goes in. And Thyestes obviously was like, that sounds really fucking weird. When is the sun going to go back on itself? It always rises in one way and sets in one way. So yeah, sure, I'll agree to hand over the kingdom if it ever reverses its course. So because he says that, Hermes is listening. Hermes tells Zeus. Zeus goes to Helios, who's the Titan sun god, and Helios is like, cool. And so he makes the sun go in the opposite direction. Atreus and Thyestes notice this, and Thyestes is pissed because he has to hand over the kingdom to Atreus, and obviously Atreus ends up exiling him, right? He just sends him away. He's like, I don't want you here. You are a threat. Leave. Now, whilst he's in exile, Atreus figures out that his wife has had a whole affair with Thyestes, and he is beyond angry when he figures this out. Bear in mind that Atreus has now had his own family with his wife, including Agamemnon and Menelaus as his sons. But anyways, as they're growing up and as Atreus is getting really annoyed with this, he decides to call Thyestes back out of exile for dinner, right? He sends a messenger to go and find Thyestes, and he tells the messenger to tell his brother that what he's considering is joint ruling of the kingdom or taking it in turns or something like that. It's obviously a total lie. He just wants Thyestes back in Mycenae. Thyestes agrees to come back, falling for the plan. Now this is important because when he shows up, Thyestes has sons of his own. Who he has them with and that whole backstory is not important for this main narrative, so I am purposely leaving that out. Thyestes comes back, he has 3 sons of his own, and when he comes back for dinner, in some versions, Atreus kills one of them. In some versions, Atreus kills all 3 of them, but regardless, a number of them get killed, and they end up being served to Thyestes at dinner as sort of like a ha, I know you slept with my wife, and ha, now all of your kids are dead. Obviously reminiscent of the whole Tantalus thing, the curse is coming back. Thyestes figures this out at the table, and he reels back when he's realized that he's been eating his children, vomits, coughs, all of this sort of stuff, is totally traumatized by what has happened. And Atreus banishes Thyestes again. He only brought him out of exile to basically show him who was boss, that he knows, and now he's willing to just throw his brother back out. And obviously Thyestes is now raging. He's absolutely raging. So this part of the story is told massively differently, and I want to highlight that right now. Again, I'm mentioning really niche mythology. In some versions, actually, Thyestes had a 4th son already prior to this moment. The 4th son made it out alive, and he is then raised in the palace because he's just a baby. right? So that is fairly fine, right? That's like a nice PG version of the story. And I say PG because it can't be universal when you have the whole story in context. But anyways, nice sort of PG version of the story. However, the very niche version of this is that Thyestes, after being exiled for a second time, goes to an oracle, and the oracle tells him that the only way he's going to get revenge on his brother Atreus is if he has another son out of incest. Again, some versions of the story are just that he has to have another son. So this is told in a multitude of different ways. We're going to go with the darkest version of the story because we're talking about a curse, right? And I want to make it as dark and gloomy as possible. So we're going to go with the version where the oracle tells him you have to have a child out of incest in order to then have that child then go back and to avenge this whole issue that's been happening. So what Thyestes does is he ends up disguising himself, going to his daughter Pelopeia. Yeah, they're not very original when it comes to names, but he has a daughter called Pelopeia, and he goes to her disguised, seduces her so that she doesn't know it's her father, and then she ends up having Aegisthus. Okay, so that's how Aegisthus comes into this. Sometimes it is just a random person. Sometimes it is, his first wife. It really depends on the version of the story, but all of these versions do exist, and they are very, very dark. Regardless, though, we're going to go with the version of Pelopeia, and Pelopeia, at kind of around the same time, ends up running into Atreus, because Atreus has realized that he probably should have killed his brother when he had the chance, and now he's having a shit ton of anxiety thinking that Thyestes is out there, and Thyestes probably wants to kill him. So he's been going out looking for Thyestes, trying to murder him, and ends up running into Pelopeia one day, not knowing that Pelopeia is Thyestes' now baby mama, but also daughter. So he's now single, he hooks up with Pelopeia, and he brings her back to Mycenae. Now, Pelopeia was obviously impregnated by Thyestes, but around the same time, and so when Pelopeia gives birth to Aegisthus, in this version of the story, Atreus thinks that it's his child. So when Aegisthus is born, he is raised in the palace as if a brother of the other two. Now, again, this does change because a lot of the mythologies state that Agamemnon and Menelaus knew always that Aegisthus was just their cousin. Aegisthus, it's very, very complicated, basically. So I would take all of this with a bit of grain of salt. You just have to know that Aegisthus is raised alongside Agamemnon and Menelaus at Mycenae. Mythology is such a complicated place to exist. Anywho, we're now going to fast forward a few years. Now, Aegisthus has grown up, Agamemnon and Menelaus have grown up, and Atreus' anxiety has never subsided because he has never seen Thyestes since he banished him for the second time, right? So when Agamemnon and Menelaus are old enough, sends the two of them out there to go and find Thyestes and to bring him back so that they can lock him up in the dungeon. So the two boys go out and they do that. They do lock Thyestes up in the dungeon, right? In Mycenae. I'm making this much more dramatic than it actually is. But so they basically lock him up, and Aegisthus is then told by Atreus to go down and to kill Thyestes, not knowing that Thyestes is his father. But Aegisthus is young at the time. He's not as strong as his cousins, right? So he's not as strong as Agamemnon and Menelaus because he's not as old as them. And so when Aegisthus goes down there, he is very easily overpowered by Thyestes. And in this version of the story, Thyestes overpowers him and he says to Aegisthus that he is going to spare his life so long as Aegisthus goes upstairs and gets his mum and brings his mum downstairs. So Aegisthus is like, fine. So he goes upstairs, brings the mother down, brings Pelopeia down. In the version of the incest story, that then Thyestes comes clean about all of this. He proves that he is the father. He proves that he is also the father of Pelopeia and the father of Aegisthus. And in this version of the story, Pelopeia is so distraught by this truth coming out that she kills herself on the spot. That is a very mythological thing to do, very historical thing to do in such an instance. So she does that, end of Pelopeia, and Aegisthus then gets basically a whole new mission, which is to avenge this whole horrible that's been happening with Thyestes. Long story short, Atreus ends up dying, Thyestes and Aegisthus end up getting the throne back, and they exile Agamemnon and Menelaus. Why no one is killing anyone? It doesn't make any sense. But anyways, they end up exiling those two sons, and then in the years to come, again, I'm fast forwarding through the end of the story, in the years to come, Agamemnon and Menelaus come back, and they then oust Thyestes. They kill Thyestes and they send Aegisthus off, or Aegisthus escapes into, I was going to say into the wild. What I meant was into exile, obviously. So Aegisthus lives, Thyestes does not. Now, this is then when we're all caught up, okay? Because Agamemnon and Menelaus, They have had a very turbulent childhood, to say the absolute least. And I think that's so important, okay? So they decide that Agamemnon is going to take over Mycenae, and they decide that then Menelaus is going to have to be king of another stronghold. And so therefore, when they see Helen, right, the most beautiful woman in the world, come up for grabs because her father's like, yep, she's definitely old enough to be married, Agamemnon and Menelaus decide that he is going to go down and he's going to compete for Helen, because if he has control over Sparta, then it just makes sense. Okay, so basically it then means that if anybody attacks Agamemnon, they know that Menelaus and all of Sparta are going to come, and if anybody attacks Menelaus, then they know that all of Agamemnon and Mycenae are going to come. It makes sense. So obviously when Menelaus is successful and he takes over Sparta, the brothers are pretty happy, and they assume that all of the shit that they've had to deal with in their life and generations previously to them is now over. And boy, are they mistaken! The curse on the House of Atreus is only getting started. As you guys know, Helen is picked up by Paris, whether willingly or unwillingly. That's a whole other video deep dive that we could possibly get into, but it's not for this video. She ends up going to Troy, right? So Menelaus, what we need to bear in mind is that Menelaus is now not the rightful king of Sparta because he just married into this family, so he is panicking. And that's when Agamemnon is like, well, we're all gonna go to Troy to get Helen back to make sure that Menelaus is still secure in being Sparta, because he has no business being king of Sparta without Helen there. Before the armies leave to Troy, as you guys know, Agamemnon has to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia. He's asked by the goddess Artemis to do that. And in every version, he wants to appease the gods, and so he goes to sacrifice his daughter, but not in every version does she actually die. Most people don't know that, and we're not highlighting that enough, that actually in many versions of the Trojan War, that actually Iphigenia is actually taken off the altar by Artemis. Artemis just wanted to see that Agamemnon was willing to do it, and then she puts in a deer instead. And so a deer gets sacrificed and Iphigenia is safely taken away. So not every time does Iphigenia die, but in every time, Clytemnestra is pissed. And Clytemnestra is Agamemnon's wife. So when Agamemnon and Menelaus had decided that Menelaus was going to be in Sparta, they found out that Helen had a sister called Clytemnestra. So in order to strengthen this alliance, Agamemnon married Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra's daughter was Iphigenia. Clytemnestra is now pissed to the max. They then leave for 10 years to go and fight the Trojan War. And in that 10 years, again, the curse is really rampant on Mycenae, because Clytemnestra wants Agamemnon to be in so much pain, but he's all the way across, the known world at the time. So she's kind of strapped for what she can actually do in order to hurt him. Aegisthus, though, who's in exile, sees this his time to go back and to have a chance to avenge his father and his horrible family line and his childhood. So he goes and seduces Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra wants to make Agamemnon mad, so this actually benefits everybody. And by the time that Agamemnon comes back, they have plotted to murder him in the tub, which they end up doing. Well, in most versions, Clytemnestra just ends up doing it, and Aegisthus is sort of sitting back, and he just says, I hate Agamemnon, so I supported her in it, but I didn't actually do it. Anywho, regardless of that, they do murder the king when he comes back after 10 years, but unfortunately, Clytemnestra has 3 other children. She's got Iphigenia, who is dead or alive at this point, depending on the mythology you read. She then has Electra. She then has Chrysothemis, which is the daughter that everybody forgets because she doesn't really do anything interesting. Chrysothemis is there, and her son Orestes. When Agamemnon comes back, Orestes is not there. Orestes has been sent away. Orestes is a problem because the curse in the House of Atreus, now that Agamemnon has been killed, and bear in mind Helen was taken away, so these guys are really dealing with the most shit in their lives possible. But Orestes hears of this, and Orestes is like, well, my mother can't just kill my father and expect me not to avenge him. So Orestes comes back, and he decides that he is going to kill Clytemnestra and her new boyfriend Aegisthus, and that's exactly what he does. And the end of this story, properly in mythology, ends with Orestes going up against this trial of the Furies, which are the goddesses of vengeance, who have been tormenting him for the longest time after he kills his mother, because that's a big no-no in mythology. So that's really the end of what I have to say, because there's nothing really following that. That was a very abrupt end, but if you guys want any more details on the Curse in the House of Atreus and how these characters deal with it, I do make summary videos on this channel of different texts, and you guys should check that out. So I recently uploaded the Oresteia, which obviously is dealing with the Clytemnestra killing Agamemnon and Orestes killing Clytemnestra and the trial, so you guys can catch up on that. on the channel. And I've also done multiple videos on the Trojan War. I do breakdowns of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which also reference this curse in the House of Atreus in various different ways and this family line. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support, and we'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on Moan Inc. So I'll see you guys then.